We are happy to have you, the people watching, and we are happy to have our host here. Today, we are celebrating the International World Refugee Day, a day that marks refugee situations, that also highlights the predicament and the plight of refugees across the world. As we know, current data puts the refugee population in the world at around 100 million people who have either been forcefully forced out of their home countries or fled for fear of their lives. And joining me today in this conversation about refugees, are distinguished people who are in this area of refugees, who have also some experience, but also passion for this group of people. I begin with the lady, Scovia Aweko, whom I'm going to allow introduce herself, and then we shall have Dragan, Mr. Dragan Atujune, introduce himself, and consequently we shall have another distinguished person from Kisoro, who also deals with refugees, to introduce himself, and the show will begin. Please, Scovia, introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Martin. Hello, everybody. As Martin said, my name is Scovia Aweko. I am currently a PhD candidate studying political behavior, attitudes, and preferences towards refugees in Uganda. I'm happy to be here and to share some of the insights from the research that I've been doing over time on the issue of refugees and forced displacement, migration in general.
Okay, thank you for being precise. Mr. Atujune, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Martin. My name is Atujune, and I work with the Refugee Law Project. I'm a legal assistant based in the Ajumani Refugee Office, so you can call me a foot soldier of this work. I interact with refugees every day, and I've been in this for quite a while. I interacted with refugees in 2018, and that was during my internship. That was but it was a short time, but now that with them every day. Their hopes, everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Atujune, a foot soldier on these refugee matters. So let's begin with you, Dragan. Want you to paint for us the picture of the current status of refugees in this country, how Uganda is standing, how many refugees do we have, how many host districts or host communities are there. Just give us a simple introduction of the current status of refugees in this country. I know you do not speak for the UNHCR or the Office of the Prime Minister, but as a person, yes, we'd like you to paint for us a picture of the refugee status in this country. As a person who is on ground, we are aware that you don't speak for the UNHCR or the Office of the Prime Minister, but you at least interface with them. Paint to us the general picture of refugees. How many refugees do we have in this country? What are those key areas where they are hosted? Are we seeing more, or are we seeing the number reduce? And how is it so far?
Oh, okay. Thank you. You cannot talk about the current status of refugees in Uganda by isolating the history of refugees in Uganda. Refugees have been here. Legally recognized refugees have been here since 1914. That's when we received our first refugees. And these were not refugees that you see these days from our South Sudan DRC. These were Polish refugees who are fleeing Europe. At that time, 1914, we had 2 refugee settlements. That was in Nigeria and Koja in present day 6,750, and they were supported by the British colonial government at the time. There were structures, and maintained some of those structures, but at the bottom they were staying in villages of around 500 people per village, headed by village heads, and all these were Polish people. And we've gone like this until today. I don't know if it is boasting or which one I can use. Today we are hosting the highest number of refugees in Africa. That is 1.5 million refugees. These refugees are hosted in northwestern Uganda and West Nile and southwestern Uganda. Out of the total number of districts we have, 12 of them are refugee hosting districts. There are 6 in northwestern Uganda and West Nile, and 5 in southwestern Uganda, plus Kampala. Now, the refugees in Kampala are a bit different because they do not stay in situations like how the people in other settlements do. 12 refugee hosting districts, we have a total of 30. We have a total of 30 refugee settlements. These 30 refugee settlements, 24 are in the north and 6 are in southwestern Uganda, with the biggest refugee settlement being Bidi refugee settlement, established in 2016 to respond to the South Sudanese crisis, which was at its peak during that time. And within a very short period of about 1.5 years, that settlement reached its peak and stopped taking in new people. The oldest refugee settlement we have is in Nachivale in Isinjiro district. It was established in 1958, but gazetted in 1960. And it has been taking on refugees. Most of them are from the DRC and Burundi. Uganda is also, it is praised for its refugee policies. Refugee policies like the CRF, that is the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, the REHOP, Refugee Host Population Empowerment, all these, and they have not stopped here in the country, but they have gone on to play at the global stage. For example, the CRF, the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, was triggered here by the UNHCR, and it later formed a very important part in informing the current global compact on refugees, which it is a non-binding international agreement which ensures that refugees and hosts live in harmony. In other words, it has four aims. 1, to ease the pressures on host countries. 2, to enhance self-reliance of refugees. In other words, move away from the humanitarian response to development-based response to refugees, and also to expand the access to third country solutions. And the fourth importance of this CRI, of the Global Compact for Refugees, is to support the conditions in countries of origin so that there are safe returns when peace returns. Now, this Global Compact for Refugees has 2 parts. That's the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework and the point of actions. And like I said, the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework was tailored here in Uganda. It was first experimented here in Uganda before it was adopted on the global stage. So you can see Uganda is not just a country hosting 1.5 million refugees in 2 regions of the country and the capital, but it is a major player at the international stage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Atujune, for that comprehensive opening. and to point to us the general picture of the refugee framework as it stands in Uganda, but also on the global scale. It's great to hear that Uganda inspires a lot of refugee policies in the world. Before I go to you, Scovia, we have been joined by our third panelist, Mr. Rugaju. Please, Mr. Rugaju, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us who you are, what you do, and yes, and that will be it. Then you'll join in the conversation, and we shall present you with an opportunity to make a presentation still. Mr. Rugaju, please introduce yourself.
This is Rugaju Ahimbisibwe. I'm the Deputy RDC Kanungu. And Kanungu, as you well know, it is on the border of Uganda and DRC. And fortunately, this topic is very relevant and timely as we are receiving very many refugees crossing over from DRC, especially from Eastern DRC, who are coming to Uganda because of the M23. So I stay in Kanungu, and that's where I'm working and operating from.
Okay, thank you very much, Gad, for that brief introduction. Scovia, the Dragan painted for us a picture of how Uganda has these amazing policies in regard to the refugee issue. And he also gave us a brief history. I invite you to, of course, in relation to the history of the refugee crisis in the world, to sort of also paint for us a global picture of the refugee impasse. Why do we continue to have refugees in the world? Why do we still have such issues where people leave their countries? Give us a global overview of the refugee crisis, and that the global status of this refugee situation.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Mr. Atujune, for actually starting us off on the conversation and painting a very clear picture of the history of refugees in Uganda. As Dragan said, Uganda started hosting refugees in 1914, with Polish refugees being our first entrance into the country. But we also have to kind of think back, what was happening in 1914 for us to actually be receiving refugees all the way from Europe. And so 1914 was when, we had World War I, and that kind of set the precedent for refugees and the sort of people that we consider refugees in the world today, as we see that the actually number one cause of forced displacement in the world is civil war, conflict, different types of political violence. And I use political violence as a broad term to kind of capture all the sort of persecutions that different people might face in the world because of their identities, either be it ethnicity, their sexual orientation, their gender, their religion, their political affiliations, the sort of social groups that people identify with. We see that a lot of people decide to leave their homes when home becomes unsafe because someone is forcing them. There's a force that actually is that basically makes homes so uncomfortable, unsafe, that people decide to pretty much leave what they are so familiar with, like what they are comfortable with, to go and venture somewhere else, somewhere unknown, somewhere where there's so much uncertainty. And pretty much that is a fate across the globe. In around starting from around 2012, 2013, an influx of Syrian refugees who were fleeing persecution from the Islamic State. We see people in places like Ecuador, El Salvador that are fleeing, right? Political violence, not coming just from the government, but also like people like drug lords during when they get caught up in drug wars, all of that, right, consists in the Ugandan case and in our neighboring countries, we've seen a plethora of, right, different forms of rebel groups forming. And so once rebel groups form and then there's conflict, right, people then, home becomes unsafe and people decide, excuse me, to leave. And so as we're celebrating World Refugee Day, we kind of think back to some of those reasons why people are being displaced and why they actually need assistance and help from global entities to actually provide them with the protection that they need. And so World Refugee Day started off, actually before it was World Refugee Day, it was Africa Refugee Day, because at that point in time, Africa was producing the highest number of refugees. And so we find that our refugees actually needed protection, and we needed to find ways to organize, mobilize ourselves, and be able to sustain their lives wherever they end up in. And so in 2001, the United Nations General Assembly, through a resolution, decided in collaboration with the AU to basically adopt the 20th of June to become World Refugee Day. Instead of just highlighting the fate of African refugees, realize that the refugee problem is a global problem, not just an African problem, that pretty much everyone needs to be involved in, especially in trying to mitigate some of the conditions, the drastic conditions that refugees have to go through when they are settled in the countries that they seek refuge in. And that being said, so this year's theme is, I think, the right to actually seek safety, the right to safety. And we see that drastically because we're still trying to redefine who is a refugee, who is entitled to safety, and where can they go. And we see that with the debacle of the UK and Rwanda the UK basically trying to offshore its refugee problem to Rwanda, and so many people coming to actually protest that and say that Rwanda is actually unsafe, who are sexual minorities. And that has set the tone for a lot of migration today. There's a lot of backlash towards migrants, not just in Rwanda, even not just right in those Western countries, but even in host communities and refugee groups. We see basically people not wanting to have refugees in their communities. And I can go into like the details later of what are some of the reasons behind those backlashes. But pretty much we see that even though there are protections for refugees, for people who are, forcibly displaced, the world is still very much unsafe because there's the right structures to be able to take care of our refugee problem the way that we should. And I talk that I speak when I say that I'm talking about the Ugandan context where we heavily rely on encampment. And one of the reasons why we rely on encampment is that we expect that once conflict is over, these refugees can return to their home countries. But what we've seen is that the countries where we receive refugees from have been going through multiple waves of conflict, and therefore it is impossible for those refugees to go back home. And so they end up staying for very, very long periods of time in refugee camps. Continue. Did you want to say something, Martin?
Yes, I just wanted to cut you short so that you don't preempt, the entire conversation. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Scovia. Now I want to go to Gad. Scovia actually mentions quite a number of important points in regard to readiness of a country receiving refugees. You work with the government of this country, and you work actually with the office of the president, the highest decision, perhaps the highest office in the land. So, and I want to ask you, how ready is Uganda in regard to, and you could, if you can, also speak to the readiness of your district. How ready or how prepared are we to continue hosting refugees? We know that, like you noted in your introduction, that Uganda has received another, like Scovia calls it, another wave of refugees, given the current conflict in the DRC. So how ready, and this could also apply to you, Dragan, who is a foot soldier, how ready is Uganda to host? And if when they come here, do we give them the necessary kind of support that they need and the necessary support that is required of the host, government to give to refugees?
Oh, yes. Uganda, first, I would want you to know that political will is the most important factor in everything. Political will mean the readiness or the willingness of the political leaders to accept the refugees. As one of the panelists has just said, we need to know that these are people who are living, who have been safe and happy in their homes, but due to either political instability, they are unsafe in their homes, or they are forced out of their homes and they are running out for their lives. Their lives are being threatened. Because their lives are threatened and they have lost all the property, they have lost lives. Now, the remaining few, they have to run to a safe place. One, we must know that when refugees are moving, they have to go to a place where they know they will be received and they will not be handed over to be massacred. And one of the places is one called Uganda. Uganda has been the receiving country, and basically because of political will by His Excellency Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, the President of the Republic of Uganda, who opened up the country to the refugees because he understands that refugees are people just like us, but due to some instabilities, they are unsafe. Now, Uganda is very ready to receive refugees, and the readiness is that we have capability and willingness. So when you have the willingness and you have capability to host them, then they come. For example, Kisoro district and Kanungu district receive the refugees. After receiving, we screen them in our districts, then we send them to their camps. And one of the nearest camp is Nachivale, which is in Sinjiro, where we can receive thousands. For example, this very week, we have received thousands of Congolese because of the M23 fighting on the borders. They had captured one of the districts of Congo, which is on the border with Uganda. And most of those people, in thousands, they crossed over to Uganda. So when they cross here, they are crossing because they have heard that Uganda is ready and has the political will to receive them, treat them well, and host them. So Uganda hosts them. UNHCR also supports us. When we get them, they give us financial support, they give us food, but the political will and the willingness of the country, especially the leader, also plays a big role. Yeah, that's what I can say.
Thank you very much for giving us that side of the story of the readiness of the government in collaboration with other partners. Before we bring Frederick, who has also joined us on this conversation, I want to maybe just pose a question or just put a statement out for us to reflect on, so that perhaps, if you will, any of you can respond to it later. This morning, the BBC aired a story. No, actually not this morning. It was on the last week, Thursday. The BBC aired a story about the Rwanda UK debacle, where the government of Britain wanted to send refugees to Rwanda. No, not refugees, actually, people who had gone to seek asylum. Some of them could be recognized as refugees anyway. And but then the courts in the country and the European court sort of put an injunction on that move. Now, when they interviewed one of the political leaders in Rwanda, I think a political leader of one of the major political parties, he noted that, well, whereas Rwanda could be willing, the government could be willing, they also have their own limitations as a country. They have unemployment rates that are high, they have limited resources, to name it. And to send people to Rwanda would also be to add much pressure on their economy. How does that play out morally, but also how does that play out economically? That could be something you could later respond to. Frederick, would you please unmute and introduce yourself, and also, introduce yourself, what you do, and generally give us your personal experience when it comes to the work among refugees, or for that matter, the people of concern for purposes of our topic.
Right, thank you very much. My name is Dramadri Frederick. I am a freelance journalist. I write for West Nile Today News. I also write for Refugee Migration Media. I also write for West Nile Web, and I do a piece of, I do reporting stories for radio parties in Eru. Where I am is where you will find the largest number of refugees currently. This is in West Nile. I've done stories for around 3 years in my career, and I've done so many stories about refugees and the host communities, the issues that they go through, and so on and so on. But coming to the point, looking at the current situation of the refugees in the country, I may say at least we are trying to balance. In my own assessment, we are trying to stabilize, just because when the refugees came in the first time, especially in West Nile in 1994, that was in a place called a Cafe refugee settlement in the district. There was only, I think, what was provided for these people as startup were only 5 poles. 5 poles were given to each household to do their constructions. The shelter is there, bathing shelter, the toilets, the houses. You are supposed to construct them from this, including the kitchen. So this was a very hard moment that these people could not cope up. And I think the local governments did their part by providing a few trees that were planted. You remember, this region is famously known of growing tobacco, and people grow a lot of trees to cure the tobacco, the eucalyptus trees. So these were cut down, and eventually the influx continued, and the either impact now goes on to deforestation and all sorts of those. But in my reporting, I realized one, most journalists in the country focus on what and why. You see, there's nothing like providing ways of mitigating such issues that they have so far identified. And in this, we have realized that government tends now to look at journalists as people who are not reporting the rightful things. And then they have identified the rightful problems, but for government to intervene immediately, you needed to provide solutions. Yes, Ella?
Please, no, it's okay. You can go on. I request the host to mute a participant that is not talking, who is not on the floor.
All right. Sorry for that interruption. So this made government to misunderstand what journalists are actually doing. And as a result, all that journalists do is not appreciated in the country, looking at all that is happening. If you look at the situation, the current situation in these refugee camps, much as the Congolese come via Rua to some of these camps, others almost actually, others settle in some of the towns like Rua City, which is at the border, even Koboko, they remain there, they are unregistered, and now it is bringing pressure on the local governments, which is something government needs to take key note about. The current situation is now, after these polls, these constructions and so on have been done, you realize that there's already depletion of the vegetation cover, even encroachments on wetlands, as people look at the nature as the only opportunity of getting money. Look at sand mining, these poor methods of fishing, where somebody pours chemicals in the water and eventually goes on with this fishing. And the issues of charcoal burning, illegal logging, even if it is legal, you realize that somebody is saying these 25 hectares of land, I've already paid for it. He produces a receipt from the district. So it is always very hard. Like the neighboring districts might not know about this, will impound this, and eventually people will say, no, you see, I have this. So you cannot stop such persons. So you will realize that, yes.
Thank you very much, Frederick, for that personal, story and personal experience. And talking about personal experiences, I am inviting Mr. Atujune to tell us about his personal experience in working in this refugee in these refugee environments. Your personal experience, how you perceive, the entire situation. Do you also feel at times overwhelmed? How do you see the state of many of these refugees? And perhaps what can be done more to improve their lives? Yes, I want to hear your personal. I know you've had a conversation. Please mute if you're not speaking. Please.
May I finish first?
No, I had Frederick. Okay, let me give you like 30 seconds, but I want each presenter to be a bit brief because yes. I can easily come in. So please use 30 seconds.
Sorry, I was not guided. So what is currently happening is you realize that there's already conflict between the refugees and the host communities. There are cases of deaths registered where people, maybe either the refugees have gone to fetch firewood, some distances, somebody's killed there. You may not know who has killed who.
And Frederick, I want you to pause there. It's among the things we're actually going to tackle today. In the preparatory text, I had noted that there are usually tensions, but we shall come to that in a moment. For now, I want other members to build on what you've been saying, giving their personal stories in this work, surrounding refugees. So let me hear you, Dragan.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. For my personal experiences working with refugees, I work with both refugees and hosts, and it's a very interesting experience. Interesting because when you're working with these people, you are not just signing off things, closing deals, and you don't know what is happening behind. You know that whatever you do is going to have an impact. And in most cases, this impact is a real impact on real lives. And sometimes you can see it right then and then, especially with a working client. Someone comes in with a complicated legal problem, like Dramadri said, issues of rape. Someone doesn't know what to do, doesn't know where to go, doesn't know. But you take on such a case, prosecute it until the end, and at the end of the case, you see this person smiles and like, at least there's some form of justice. Or you find someone they've opened up a bank account, but they come to you, they cannot access their money. Why? Because when they were capturing their data during the verification process or during the screening process, they somehow messed up their personal details. This person does not know absolutely what to do next. The bank is telling him or her, no, you can't access this money, yet it's their money. So working on a document that will rectify such a matter, and you see this person saying, oh, at least now my children are going to have something to eat. At least now I'm going to pay fees and my kid won't be chased out from school. Those are some of the things that, you say, yes, I'm doing something. Most of the projects I work on here are to do with gender in humanitarian situations. So, and there are some things you find yourself immersed in work, you are busy all the time. And when the work reduces or becomes scarce, you start to feel some helplessness, and you're not yourself because of the way you've invested yourself in this work. You also discover that there are some things which are never talked about, things which the academia does not expose, things which the journalists do not talk about. Someone tells you a story of how they fled the war, the torture they went through, the sexual violence they went through, and you have to find a solution for this person, or you have to find help for them. So it drowns you. This work drowns you into it. It consumes you. But it also comes with some challenges, especially where there are situations where you cannot give an immediate solution, or even if the solution is there, it seems too far to achieve. And this person has been through very many processes. They feel frustrated, and sometimes they take out that frustration on you. You find they'll tell you things like, you're a stranger, you're not supposed to be here. If you weren't here, we wouldn't be eating. So yes, it hurts. Sometimes it hurts, but it's also part of the work, and you also have to understand the kind of people we are dealing with and the situations they've gone through. But this work also, it's also in a way empowering for both the people we serve and ourselves. Because like I said, that I work on gender and humanitarian situations. Many of the projects I work on are related to that. You find that most of the women I deal with are refugees from South Sudan. We all know the human rights record of that country. And we know how women are treated in that country. So when someone comes to you, or you go to them, because most cases they're even afraid to come to you, they're afraid to come to office because they feel like that's a public space, that's a space for men. So when you go into these communities, taking activities there, and they come to you and they tell you, oh, I didn't know I could do this, I didn't know I could do this. You go through, take them through trainings, show them their rights, life skills, all these things, and they come out empowered. And you see results like, now, I don't think this has been achieved anywhere else, but right now, in political leadership in refugee situations, Atujune is the first to achieve gender parity. Because of this work we've done, because of these experiences, women now occupy 54% of political offices in refugee situations. These are women who came, who couldn't speak for themselves, who didn't know the language, who couldn't read signposts, who couldn't report to police because they didn't know English, who couldn't get any service. But they go through the whole process of the aid you give them, giving them the language, showing them what to do, when to do it, and what to follow up with, and showing them where to go. And they come out empowered. They come out. I don't believe in miracles, but it's a miracle. It's a miracle when you see such a person comes out and she's invited to an international panel to speak on a given subject, speak on conflict-related sexual violence, to speak on gender in conflicts, to speak. It's uplifting, and it's one of the reasons that keeps us going. This work also, it gives opportunities. Like, I'm here speaking to you. I couldn't have this opportunity if I was in a law firm closing mortgages and chasing.
Thank you very much. I want to pause it there, and ask for Scovia's personal experience, and we shall have God's personal experience. Then after that we shall go into the other details of the relations, like Frederick had introduced relations between host communities and the refugees. But now I want to hear your experience, Scovia, but also you could give us a gender perspective on this issue, and also a perspective of experiences of more marginalized groups of refugees. The UNHCR has noted that 41% actually of refugees, are children, and of course the percentage is even higher for women. Nonetheless, Dragan has also noted that that Uganda, and specifically where he works, in the district he works, the settlement he works, there's closing in the gap, the gender gap in refugee affairs. So on top of your personal experience, please try to explain to us the gender dynamics and the situation of the more marginalized groups of refugees. You see, refugees are marginalized as an entire group, but again, the way society works is that there will always be more people who are, unfortunately, more marginalized. Please.
Thank you, Martin. So I think for many Ugandans, especially in this day and age, when we talk about refugees, they see it as a problem, or we see it as a problem that is like so distant from us, right? When in actual sense, like, we ourselves, Uganda, as a country, has been a producer of refugees and internally displaced people. The recent example, of course, is northern Uganda, that went through over 20 years of civil war, and we had internally displaced people, like people who they weren't considered refugees because they did not have to leave their country, but at the same time, right, the same conditions that people's countries, and they were going through the same challenges that a lot of refugees face. And before I even go into my own personal experience, from the research that I've been doing, when you speak to people, right, one of the reasons that Ugandans cite for actually being welcoming towards refugees is, one is Africans, right? Like when a guest comes over, you cannot chase them out, and therefore you have to embrace them and make sure that you set up comfortable. I think is that we also see violence in this country as being arbitrary. My research mainly focuses in West Nile, and most of the people you talk to will tell you, yeah, one of the reasons that we should be nice to refugees is as refugees ourselves. And so there's that kind of fear that because of the uncertainty of violence and the arbitrary nature of violence in this country, we ourselves might at some point or could at some point find ourselves as refugees in Uganda. But talking about my personal experience, and I've never been a refugee, but visiting refugee conditions that these refugees have to live in. Many refugees are living in tents across our refugee camps, in refugee camps across the country. And that is like the specific problem with the encampment, the reliance on encampment as our main refugee policy. Because when you go into those refugee camps, you see that people are really living in situations that are very, very much unsafe. People are living in tents. The conditions are at many times unsanitary, but also living in camps themselves, people will tell you, takes away their sense of agency. Because then, even though our refugee policy says that refugees can be self-reliant by providing them things like land to farm and all of that, we still see that donations, they have to rely on aid. They basically lose their sense of agency. These are people that in their countries, before they came into Uganda, were pretty much able to provide for themselves without any form of assistance. Of course, there are layers to this, right? If you look at those who are rich and capable, and those who are maybe the poorer refugees might not have been able to fully provide for themselves and might have needed assistance here and there. But when they come into our refugee camps, we really, really take away that sense of agency that someone actually feels like, they own themselves. Because in many, many cases, they are waiting, The refugee camps are meant to be a place of waiting, in anticipation, in uncertainty, for either resettlement or for the conflicts to end, or to be given food, or to be given provisions. And that is psychological traumas that these refugees come in with, because if you're fleeing conflict, if you've been displaced, obviously, there's so much psychological distress involved in that. And then when you add into the waiting, the uncertainty about, what next for me, and we see that, as Martin mentioned, we have kids who, women and children, women have to give birth in these refugee camps, and then they give birth to children who, the legality, not the legality of the children themselves, but basically there's an increased chance of statelessness, when someone becomes a refugee, and then when kids are born in refugee camps. And so that really also exacerbates the issue of, can they actually be provided for by governments? How do we even consider, someone really not belonging to any state, the kind of distress that you have to go through, to consider basically not belonging to any kind of state and not being able to get legal documents, be considered capacity in that regard. And so that exacerbates and kind of compounds some of the psychological issues that women and that people go through in refugee camps. And when it comes to women, Mr. Atujune kind of hinted on the issue of sexual violence. We see that in these conflict situations, women are prone to, you see that many of these rebels, these soldiers, using rape as a weapon of war. And so when they escape these situations, they come into our countries as refugees. But even in those refugee camps in most cases are also not safe, because we see a lot of sexual violation, sexual harassment happening within those refugee camps. And that in itself makes the place that is supposed to be safe for these women very much unsafe. And of course, there are efforts being done to kind of mitigate some of these problems, but we still see women, especially having to really reconsider their lives in these refugee camp settings. And then Dramadri mentioned the issue of, right, people being attacked as they go to collect firewood, as they go to collect water. And you can imagine that, right, the demographics that we're looking at here, who goes to fetch water, who goes to collect firewood. It's mostly women who then have to encounter these types of violence when, right, they're simply looking for water to drink, firewood to cook their own food, and then they're met with this kind of disproportionate violence when they're just trying to live their lives. And so, yes, actually, in Uganda, over 50% of our refugees are women, and to see that they continue to face violence in places where they're supposed to be considerably safe is quite heartbreaking, and that kind of adds on to like the psychological trauma, psychological distress that they have to go through every day, and as they navigate their lives.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Scovia. You've mentioned something, and indeed. Also, Frederick noted it, unregistered, all stateless people. They're unregistered refugees, and then they're also somewhat stateless, some were born here, and then their nationality status is still in question because Uganda, first of all, does not necessarily automatically recognize people who are born here to be Ugandans. I could be wrong, someone can correct that, but there is many increasing number of people who are stateless, and I hope, God, you're noting this because the question is coming to you. Why do we still have unregistered people, unregistered refugees? And take note that the Convention on Refugees and also the ensuing protocol and other protocols among them, other protocols and other instruments give a registration or documentation, access to documents as a right, every refugee. But we continue to see many without those documents. The UNHCR has noted that Uganda has about 130,000, approximately 130,000 refugees that are not documented, that don't even have, that are unregistered, they don't have these necessary documents. With the current influx, the number could even be higher, So why, and this is to you, God, why do we still have, unregistered refugees? Of course, after answering that, we'd like to hear your personal experience, but I couldn't let this pass because you're here in the position of, at least you are in government, one or two things.
One, I will begin with the unregistered refugees coming in the country without documents. Partly, you need to know why refugees come. They come here when in their country it has become uncomfortable for them, and it's not planned. Like, for example, the refugees we are receiving from DRC, the rebels come into a community, they rape ladies, they kill men, and when you look at the percentage you've been sharing, especially what Scovia shared, with over 55% of the refugees being women, is that some men are captured as prisoners of war. They are taken as to join into their armies and their forces, and the remaining women run away from their countries and they are forced to be refugees here. So it is unfortunate that these people, they come when it is not planned. When they bomb one town, then the next town, people just run, and they run aimlessly. They just find themselves here. Some of them don't plan. Maybe those people who are seeking asylum, those ones have planned and they know they are coming, they bring documents. But for the case of some of the refugees we have in Uganda, They come because it is not planned. And when we receive them, before they are taken to the camps, we first screen them. And screening them, we are looking at, we also want Uganda to remain stable. I know some people will argue and say, how do you say Uganda, we are stable? But when you look at how many refugees we have here from how many countries, you really realize that we are comfortable in our country. But when they reach here, the first thing I said, we receive any refugee, but again, we screen them to ensure that the ones who have come are actually refugees and are not rebels. Because if you're not careful, you may be receiving someone thinking he's a refugee, but yet you are receiving ADF, for example, who are near us in the DRC. So the screening is very serious, and the security part must be involved to ensure that the people who have come, they need help. They need help. They're not just coming to masquerade as people who need help, yet they are rebels. So that is why screening. Then number two, when you look at these people, it is very true that children are high, because in most cases, when these rebels come to communities, they are not recruiting children. And women, sometimes they are raped, sometimes they are beaten, and these women are forced to run to another country for safety. And when they are running, they run to a country where they know that they are safe. However, I may disagree with Scovia, where she said that some women are sexually harassed in refugee camps, because refugee camps are protected. And where they are sexually harassed, that is a situation. Maybe they are harassed by their fellow refugees. And if they don't report to security, then no one knows. But when they report to security, then those fellow refugees are also treated like other people here who are harassing other people apart from refugees. People being attacked as they go to collect firewood and water in some refugees. Actually, I think now the government has tried to ensure that most of the refugee camps, they have enough water. However, firewood sometimes can run short. So when they are in their communities are protected. And every community we have as a refugee, even here in Kanungu, Kisoro, where we say they are receiving for screening, we have a full funding security of agents and operatives to ensure that there is safety, there is no harassment, there's no nothing. But as you know, people, when they are in their camps, and when they are in their camps, we don't allow men to cross to the women's side, especially here at the screening side. For example, like Kisoro and Kanungu, we don't allow people to join. Some of them claim that we are hindering, for example, a man from joining with his wife, but we tell them we are refugees. Until we screen you and we take you to the respective refugee camp, you don't think about sex. Really, you should be thinking about life and how to live and how to eat, how to be housed. So when you come and what you are thinking about is sex, then we would say, why didn't you remain there and you have your sex there? Because we would expect that someone who has run for help, if he is not thinking about sex, sex is another thing that you think about when you are comfortable, when the mind is refreshed and the mind is comfortable. So when he's raped, I would say it's like, for example, I don't know which community you come from yourself, but if a lady is raped in your area, most ladies, they have that kind of inferiority complex, and they don't want to say what has happened. But when you say, like now, I talk now as an RDC, we have many women that are raped, but for fear of shame, they don't want to report the cases. However, they keep talking behind their curtains. Behind the scene, you hear they are being raped. Even when you call them to police or you call them to RDC's office, you ask them, I have heard that you've been raped. They say, no, I have not been raped. Yet you know the information is the person has been raped. So that is an information that the country cannot really own. So I want to say that why most refugees are not registered, is because they come without documents. And why they come without documents is that it is not planned. When, for example, they hit the next community, this community runs immediately. You find someone who was in the garden and he ran from the gardens and they came here. My personal experience would be that what I have seen with refugees, we have received some of them. When you screen them, you find some bad characters. They are joined in, and what we do, we arrest them. We take them back to their country where they are coming from, or they are treated as rebels. We have screened in most people who cross from Congo. You find they are ADF. You screen them, you find someone has a sack, but when you power down a sack of cassava, when you power down the sack of cassava, they are guns inside. Yeah, we have very many experiences that we have with these refugees. So screening is done basically by OPM and the security operatives, both the ESO, the ISO, and the RDC and the police. And for example, here in Kanungu, where I'm at Matanda screening area, we have a whole police unit, all well-furnished police station that deals with the refugees. So I want to disagree with this, some of the allegations that they are not safe because we protect them and we treat them. However, I agree that the hosting communities, they also have setbacks. When you come here as a refugee, you might find, like, for example, when the inflation has affected us, it also affects you. However, you know, these guys are allowed to run businesses. They are given accommodation, they are fed, and their rights are well protected. But when you are running a business, we give them the location, how far you can go. And some of them, they want, for example, someone says, I left my wife back. I want to keep going to see my wife. So if you want to keep going back to Congo, then go and remain there. So there are very many challenges with the refugee camps because some of them feel that they need to go dig and come back. So you question yourself and say, is this person a refugee or is just feeling comfortable in Uganda? And now he wants to live as a Ugandan and also live as a Congolese. So
Thank you very
advise.
much. Yes, complete that in a few seconds.
Advise them to choose. If you will find that you have gardens that you want to keep going to attend to, then you don't qualify to be a refugee. We have very many things with 4 factors, but if someone is in need, 1, we must make sure the person gets feeding. Number 2, we must make sure the person has accommodation. We must also ensure that their rights are protected. And next, they are allowed to run businesses to support them. And in the refugee camps, they have schools, they have places of worship, so wouldn't think that they are really uncomfortable because, as I said from the beginning, the political will is the most important thing, and the president.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gad. I would like to cut you there so that we give an opportunity to others. Thank you for that perspective and also for your response on the unregistered, the issue of some of them being unregistered. I also, mainly.
Martin, I'm sorry to cut you short, but I feel like if I don't respond to Gad's suggestion.
Please, in a minute, in a minute, so that we bring Frederick. Yes.
Yes, I can do that.
Because you'll eventually have an opportunity to say more, but just in a minute. So
I couldn't let this go. One thing for sure, Gad, is that just because someone is not reporting the sexual harassment or sexual violation that is happening to them in those refugee camps, it doesn't mean that they're not happening. Even in a setting where women are free, we see that there are lots and lots of reasons why people choose not to report, or this kind of we don't have the structures that actually enable women to feel free enough to report those sort of violations. And yes, these violations are not just happening or coming from fellow refugees, but some of the workers themselves are sexually harassing and violating women in those refugee camps. And yes, you yourself, as you said, like sometimes you know the stories, people come to you and tell you this and this has happened, but because the woman is not willing to come forward, does not mean that this violation did not happen. And therefore, what we should be focusing on is ways to mitigate this, to get rid of, right, these sort of violations happening in the refugee camps. And these violations obviously make this space very unsafe for women.
Thank you very much, Scovia. Yes, and to also be fair, I think Gad had also noted many of those shortfalls. He said, it's hard for them to report because of very many issues, but he said that at least they try to follow the law and the due process of the law. He noted that there are really serious challenges when it comes to that, and I think it was an honest kind of statement on his part to say, you know what, we are not as perfect, but also the underlying social constructs affect, the reporting, and it's maybe, but also to agree with you, is where he as if denied that, it may not happen. Maybe it's among refugees themselves. No. I think sexual violence usually happens everywhere. And we've read reports of people, even people from host communities occasioning sexual violence to refugees, but even in people of other agencies or even partners, having relations with the persons of concern. But leaving that at that, I'd like to make a correction. And it has been coming out, people are calling these camps. Uganda does not run camps. Uganda runs settlements, so that is at least the Ugandan policy. That's why refugees sort of are afforded a normal life, and you noted that, God, but then you kept on using the word camp. So camps are a rare term in Uganda. I think the last time we had camps was IDP camps, but we've progressed and we have settlements. That's why we are talking about things like the REHOP, CRF policies. All those encourage that refugees live a life like a normal life, so we don't confine them to camps. Frederick, we want to get back to you to give us the story you are giving in regard to relations between the host, communities and the refugees. Of course, this will again going to sort of borrow from the conversation we've been having about, sexual violence, or violence, the rifts between host communities and the refugees themselves, the struggle for resources, the environmental challenges that come with this, and how that affects the relations. So I want you to give us, the stories and some of the stories you've been reporting on this, and so that will inform the next discussion from our panelists. Dragan, you'll also give us your experience and how some of these are being resolved. And as a lawyer, how much is the law intervening, how much is the judiciary and other departments, and also the partners, supporting partners and implementing partners of UNHCR and the Office of the Prime Minister. So Frederick, please, yes, you take it away.
Yes, okay, thank you very much for welcoming back me to share something briefly about what is currently happening as far as the relationship between the refugees and the host communities. As I said earlier, due to the influx of the refugees, This came as one on a positive note to the host community, and also it became like a disaster to them also, in one way or the other, and this is vice versa. To the refugees, I've gone to many of these settlement centers. The life I've seen is somehow okay. Now these people are living in a better environment, but now the challenge is access to land. You know, UNHCR has already reduced the food ration, and if you used to get 14, you're going to get half of that, meaning you are supposed to at least now start using other avenues of maybe getting land from your colleagues, your friends who are host communities. So what is happening is due to the current situation, I'm talking about the prices that have been hiked each and every day, the price fluctuation in the market. Somebody claims that this is my land, and yet the other one has given to one of the refugees. This is the most common cases that we have been seeing here in Rhino Camp settlement, where somebody is claiming that this is my land, and yet the one who gave the land is the real owner, and he has even the documents. But you realize that somebody has already changed away the refugee. This one doesn't know where to go and report a case, and there's no formal agreement that they have maybe documented that this one will use it for this period of time. So that is one challenge. Two, we have seen due to the scarcity of the resources. I'm talking about the forests that they used to maybe go and pick firewood from, and even the available alternative sources of energy that were provided by some of the implementing partners. You realize that most of the partners are looking at money. There are partners that are already doing this service to what they were entitled to do in these settlement centers. That is what one thing that I've discovered. Partners are coming in the names of helping. Now you realize that this partner comes with maybe charcoal stoves or maybe solar panels and so on. And they begin to deploy their workers and sell these things to the refugees. And these people could not afford these things. You know what happens after this? People go back to the traditional ways of cutting trees, and this brings more conflict. And we have many times tried to raise this through the stories that we do, and like when we're doing stories, we inform the leaders, all the stakeholders in this, so they tend to realize what is happening in this. So when we did this, I think UNHCR has taken this up to follow some of these partners that are doing that. And they have already also brought in the legal officers into some of these settlements, mostly the big reception centers. They have instituted some courts that are effective and trying to mitigate some of these issues. The most issues that are now remaining are the access to land, and then the issues of the scarce resources that they are fighting over. But away from that slightly, there are many ways we can also, if you are not a journalist, those who are in the advocacy group, what they should focus on is telling the reality that will inform decision of the policymakers. Sometimes we tend to say we're advocating for the rights of this, we have this NGO that, or maybe the CBO that we're using to do this. But if you don't have the facts, it is hard for government to understand that there's an issue here. However much you will talk, it is always the figures, the facts that you got on ground that will inform, make government take action. And through this, we as journalists in West Nile, we formed an association called West Nile Press Association. Apart from the work that we do for the radios, the websites that we always do. What we have now come in to do is sometimes we go to these leaders and inform them. We can even address them. Say, look here, this is the challenge. This is what is happening. Much as people are fearing to report, this is the factor that we have. Go to this cell, this village, and that's where you'll get those people. Two, we have seen another one, the inter-district conflicts are growing up due to this, the coming of the refugees. We have seen Terego fighting with Mariokolo. We have seen Yumbe fighting with the Mariokolo and Terego. And these are all just because of the donations by the agencies that are trying to come and provide livelihood supports. But some of these are beyond the local governments. It will be good for the central government to also take interest in some of these issues that we have seen that are actually happening in most of these settlements. I don't know if there's something great that you have seen. Maybe on the environmental destruction in West Nile, if you look at the forest cover that we had in 19 something there, 1995, we had over 1,000 hectares of trees that were there. But now, if you move to these settlement centers, most of the trees look young, as if they have been newly planted. But that is the impact of cutting them early. And so we need to advocate for the restoration of environment if we need these people to continue living in harmony. First of all, the issues of tackling environmental degradation is a core one. Even if we don't provide these people livelihood support, at least they will be able to do something from the environment if it is safe. The war now is between human beings and the nature. It's not between human beings and human beings. That's what I've understood. But if government can take keen interest in this and they say, okay, we have policies here, we have laws. There were policies that I show when you cut one, you are supposed to plant 5. Has this been enforced? Now you see, local governments are saying they're constrained. They don't have the staff to always follow up this. So it is always hard to at least do some of these things. But if we work together and say, okay, as partners, what we do is let's come and see where the weakness is. We already have the tools. How do we start enforcing them? Because of political interest, somebody is saying, you're fighting my people. You're doing this, these are my voters, these are my this. So it is very hard for even people of goodwill to invest in some of these areas.
Thank you very much, Frederick. Yes, thank you. You've given us quite a lot of information, which I invite our colleagues here to really to have a conversation on. You know, you've mentioned the environment, but also conflicts between the host community and the refugees themselves. I also note that at times also conflicts between refugees themselves, because many of these refugees actually come in droves, like many groups, and the conflicts they had in their hosts, in their nations or in their countries are transported and transferred here, tribal, clan, name it, conflicts. So I also note that there is that major challenge. On the environment, I commend groups such as the Refugee Law Project that has a policy of reforestation, at least trying to mitigate the environmental disaster by planting more trees and increasing the vegetation. Now, I invite Dragan to please react on what Frederick has said, yeah, generally from what he has said, please build on. And
okay, thank you so much, Martin. If I'm to give an assessment of the refugee-host relations, I would say generally, they are quite positive. And this is because both populations, the refugees and the hosts, share the same social amenities. They got the same hospitals, unlike in the past when we were hosting Polish refugees, where these people are secluded from the communities to preserve their superior white classes, where they didn't allow them to move out of the settlements, and they didn't allow blacks to go into these settlements unless they were workers, and those workers are also not allowed to stay there past working time. Most of those practices are now gone. So we see both refugees and hosts interacting with each other, going to the same schools, going to the same, doing businesses, the same markets, same towns, same roads, same almost everything, same hospitals, same almost everything. But the few conflicts which arise come from majorly three areas. One is natural resources, two is resource allocation, and three is the personal relations. I'll start with the natural resources. When natural resources, I'm meaning about land, forests, and water. These are things which are very scarce, especially here in northern Uganda. And sudden increases in populations because of the sudden influx of refugees, the pressure on these natural resources becomes so much, because almost everyone, both refugees and hosts, depend on natural resources, right from the growing food itself until food, cooking that food, eating that food, the houses they sleep in, almost everything is gotten from these natural resources, forests and land. And because of that pressure, some people might feel like if we didn't have these refugees, then we wouldn't be facing the problems we are facing now. We wouldn't be facing the droughts, we wouldn't be facing the firewood shortages. And sometimes there can be conflicts. Then the other issue is land. Now, land in refugee settlements, both in southwestern Uganda and West Nile, it is, because in southwestern Uganda it is public land, but government is the government under OPM which allocates land to refugees when they arrive. In northern Uganda, land is owned customarily, so it is in the names of these clans, families, and so on. But also, government gets leases on these lands and allocates land to these refugees. How much land is each refugee given? Each refugee family is, not each refugee, but each refugee family is given 30 by 30 feet of land. It is on that land that they are supposed to construct a temporary structure. They are supposed to do their subsistence farming and exist. So sometimes when we are discussing these things and talk about self-reliance, you wonder which self-reliance can come from such a practice. But there's really no big way around it, because land is also scarce. The hosts also want to use their land. Now, how do refugees navigate this? They navigate this by going out to the host communities to hire land. So you find an acre, for example, here in Ajimani, an acre goes for 80,000 for a season. Okay. Now, when they enter an agreement, these agreements are usually oral, and then the refugee uses this land, harvests, and either pays in kind in the crop that he has planted or cash. But where does the conflict come in from? The conflict comes in where this refugee has paid for this land, and then the host who is issuing us this land dictates what the refugee should plant on that land, regardless of what the refugee's family needs, or regardless of what is selling. It has a higher value in the markets, and this refugee wants to make some money. We all know that the food rations for refugees have dropped recently. I think last week, WFP announced it's no longer giving food to the South Sudanese, and this is everywhere. Here, food rations have reduced, cash rations have reduced 19,000 per refugee. down from around 35,000. So you see, they also have no means of survival. And when they find a way of navigating this, and then the hosts they go to try to cheat them, they also feel frustrated. And that's how we end up with some of these conflicts. Now, how have we, when we come in as lawyers, as OPM and UNHCR and Refugee Law Project, when we come in to try to resolve these things, we say that, okay, let us try to make this documentation written. But then when you bring the refugees, they know their rights because we've told them. But when you take such an idea to the hosts, then the hosts think that once they put this in writing, they are giving away their land. In other words, for them, that document is a sale agreement. So you see, much as you try to navigate these things, sidestep them, there are some attitudes which make them go on and on. Then the other issue I talked about was resource allocation. The refugee host population empowerment, or what we call the REHOP strategy, says that when you bring aid to a refugee hosting area, 70% should go to the refugees, 30% should go to the nationals. But that policy is also unfair, especially to the nationals. I'll take an example of Ajumani. Ajumani has the highest number of refugee settlements in Uganda. Ajumani district alone has 19 refugee settlements. The population, host population, refugee population is 50-50. 50% refugees, 50% hosts. And then you're saying that 70% should go to the nationals, to the refugees, and 30% to the nationals. Yet these people are living, they access that, they go to the same markets, they use the same services, they face similar challenges. It's a bit unfair. So the hosts feel like they are being cheated out of this. If you're bringing help, bring it to both of us. So that's where some of these conflicts also come from. Then the other area of conflict in the refugee host relations is the personal relations. Most refugees have been here for very long. And when I say very long, I'm not talking about 2, 3, 4, 5 years. People have been here for 20 years. 20 years. They have intermarried. They feel more Ugandan than they feel South Sudanese or the Congolese. Okay? And because of these intermarriages, you find they now have children. These children have also grown, and some of them are starting to give birth to more children. And there is a gap on where do these children and children of these children fall, because our laws will not do not, if you come here as a refugee and give birth to a child, that child will also be a refugee. If you read our constitution, our Citizenship and Immigration Act, they show that you still remain a refugee regardless of how many generations you've given here. So, and then you go to these people and tell them that, oh, there's local integration, whereby you can qualify to become a Ghana citizen, but then they look at the processes and what will come at the end. They remain in a catch-22 situation, because if they go through the process of becoming a Ghanaian citizen, first of all, that process has its own challenges. Then at the end of the day, you become a Ghanaian citizen. It means that even the little help you've been receiving as a refugee will be stripped away from you. Okay? Now, that itself causes, putting someone in such a situation, of course, mentally tortures them. And then the children don't know where to belong. There's an identity crisis. So then these intermarriages with the different cultures, Ugandan cultures, and for example, South Sudanese cultures, you find now there are fights. The South Sudanese husband says, I want to take my children back to South Sudan. The woman from the Ugandan community saying, no, you can't take them. They're not South Sudanese, they're Ugandan. So that also creates conflict. And because of some of the gaps in our laws, or the implementation of our laws, that also causes conflict, and conflicts which are very, very hard to resolve, even for just a lawyer like me who's just in the field. okay, implementing activities. These are things which can be resolved at a level bigger than I operate. So yeah, those are some of the challenges, the conflicts that come up with the refugee host relations. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, Scovia.
Kind of to pick up from where Mr. Atujune has stopped, I think in most of these refugee hosting relations, there's a misperception or misconception of what some of the provisions that refugees get, about some of the provisions that refugees get, and that poses a lot of, as you know, Atujune mentioned, resource resentment. And so from the research you find that because our government itself does not adequately provide for people, and because the people in these host communities are also pretty much very, very poor people, they start feeling there's that level of jealousy of why is it that our government and the UN and all of those aid organizations, right, bypass our community and go to give help to these refugees, when in actual sense, like, we are pretty much in the same position as refugees, right? Like, we're, as God say, sorry, Atujune, I don't know why I keep calling you God. As Atujune said, this pretty much facing the same economic predicaments as refugees. And so because of those predicaments, people then want, right, that the sort of provisions that government is giving refugees, they should also get. And they absolutely, our government does not spend actually a whole lot of money on refugees. Most of the government expenditure is coming from donor organizations. But so that sort of resentment then leads to this idea of, you know, I don't want, like, we are okay with refugees in theory, but we do not want them in our neighborhoods. We do not want them in our backyards, because once they come in, then they will start taking resources away from our communities, right? They'll have to take land away from us. Like Frederick has noted, Northern Uganda is not like the most, right, like, environmentally friendly place when it comes to farming and supporting agriculture. We see that in this period of time, we're having long bouts of drought or long dry seasons, when we're supposed to be having at least 4 rainy seasons and 4 dry seasons. We've seen that we're going 9 months, 8 months without rain. And so these are people who then start feeling jealous of the fact that refugees are getting very, very little supplemental aid, whether it comes in the form of food or money, and they feel that they should be the ones also benefiting from these provisions. But the other thing is that the label of, you know, refugee as well is very alienating, and it creates this like superior, inferior, right, dynamic within society. And so we find a lot of Ugandans actually like castigating refugees for like simply being a refugee. Because you're a refugee, I'm better than you, I'm Ugandan, I have some form of ownership of this place, and you're pretty much a nobody, we're just doing you a favor. That in itself can also alienate host communities and the refugees. But one thing that we haven't actually really talked about is the fate of urban refugees in Uganda. We've pretty much talked to a lot of refugees who are in these settlements. And the reason why I bring the fate of refugees, urban refugees, is what we saw with Rwandan refugees, especially when pretty much the political tide turned against them, and how they were used between the Rwandan government and the Ugandan government. That in itself created such an unsafe atmosphere for a lot of our urban Rwandan refugees. And this, you know, the fact that the safety or the well-being of refugees is dependent on our relationship with their home governments is kind of disheartening, because, you know, we know how the game of politics goes. One day things might be good, the next day things might not be so good. And that in itself, right, kind of creates this distrust and conflict between right, the host community and the refugees that we receive. But beyond that, I think cultural differences also play a role in the refugees have with their host communities. I've heard stories of not even in the rural settings in Kampala of landlords not wanting to rent to South Sudanese refugees because of certain stereotypes that they have about the South Sudanese refugees. We hear stories about, oh, they're dirty, so they'll not be able to take care of your property, or this, so, like, you know, it's not, if you rent a 2-bedroom apartment, it's like a whole family of 10 that's going to come. And so then people, because of those kind of differences, people start to stereotype certain groups in a certain way. And one of the reasons behind that is because we are coming from kind of vastly different cultures. And so those cultural differences then influence the way that we are interacting with these different refugee groups. And it's not just that South Sudanese, we've heard stories about how people think Eritrean and Somalis are very arrogant, they don't want to integrate, when in actual sense, like, we've been living in harmony with some of these refugee groups. So those cultural differences also are influencing them in the urban areas. And the refugees in the urban areas, you know, do not get the sort of provisions that refugees in the settlements are getting, because once you leave the settlements, even though you're registered as a refugee, you're pretty much considered to be on your own. You're supposed to fend for yourselves. And so when when these refugees are coming to Kampala, trying to start out their lives, try to make a life for themselves, they're met with those challenges of, you know, people either not wanting to rent to them or treating them a certain way, you know, from a point of distrust and mistrust because of the different factors that I've mentioned.
Thank you very much, Scovia, for highlighting that. Yeah, indeed, we had actually sort of not mentioned about the urban refugees, but you bring it out and importantly, and it is important to really highlight their plight in the face of the reduce of food rations, like many of you have said, and urban refugees actually will be even more affected by that, and also reducing the amount of money, because of course town is more expensive than in rural areas. So thank you for that. Please, Gad, take it away. After then after Gad, we shall have another one round of 1 minute each to just sum up and just touch on whatever we haven't necessarily touched. Please, Gad, you have about 4 minutes to.
Right. I'm just commenting back on what other people maybe would have shared. I don't have much to say which is different from others. Some we agree, and some see it on the view of journalism, and some see it on as lawyers, but on the side of the government. We have the political will, and when these refugees come, as we have said, refugees should adjust to the laws of the country, the hosting communities. But we should know that some countries are laxed on their laws, and maybe that could have caused some conflicts and causing these people to come. And in most cases, when these people come, they are traumatized. And when they are traumatized, they need the rehabilitation in order to fit within the laws of the government. But we always emphasize that as much as there is human rights and they have their rights that should be protected, they should also respect the laws of the governments they have come in, and forget all about the laws of the countries where they are coming from. In their settlements or screening areas, we have also shared about the conflicts, and these conflicts are human. And I want to add that some conflicts are brought as trauma, as a result of trauma, because when these people are leaving their countries, they have been comfortably in their communities. when Scovia was sharing about the urban. We are looking at the urban, we are looking at the rural, and they have big challenges. When you come, like, for example, the urban settlement, you find the status is really different. Someone wants to remain at the status he was at. And when you look at intermarriages, when someone has married a Ugandan, he assumes he has become Ugandan. He wants to buy land, he wants to enjoy or vote, he wants to become a real Ugandan, but the laws of Uganda are clear on refugees. And all of these bring the conflicts, but partly these people should be rehabilitated and brought back to their normal status. But sometimes someone who is traumatized does not know it. It is only that the results or the outcome of what they do will show that someone has been traumatized. Some people who have married, for example, people who came to Uganda as a cause of genocide in Rwanda, can testify that these ladies, they have the kind of like behavior which is not common to other people who remained in Rwanda or other Rwandese. You find some ladies who are here, if someone has married her, she still has that trauma, which can be passed on to even the children. So they need to be rehabilitated. There is a need for agencies to come in and help these people. Otherwise, if they are not helped, this traumatized situation can cause them to conflict with the hosting communities. And we've been having it. That's why you find like communities where they are, especially settlements, there must be security forces to put them in line. So you don't assume that they have come and they will just agree with the laws here. And it is very hard. It is very hard. For example, you find a country has not, we have been talking about natural resources. You find some country does not mind about cutting trees, does not mind. The laws concerning the land management, land use is different from the laws in their countries. So when they come here, they want to use the laws of their country, yet the law of Uganda would be different. Some refugees have been here for so long, and they think they are now Ugandans. They even want to step over Ugandans. And when you get into the market area, you find there is a lot of conflict. And someone has actually forgotten that he's a refugee. Because if someone has been here for 30 years, 20 years, he has grown, he has children, and he forgets that the children who have been born here are also refugees. So he assumes he's Ugandan, he has Ugandan national. You know, they want to just Uganda. So this, it is a very big conflict that the government tries to come in. When they come here, they come as refugees, they need help. But after a short time, they forget. And this is a human kind of, it happens to every person. In most cases, when you have a problem, and once your problem has been eased, you even assume that you never had. So this kind of thing.
Thank you very much, God. Thank you very much for that.
So as I end up with this, when we look at the relations between between the host communities and the refugees, it is very, very, very important to know that there must be someone to remind them that there is a law of the country that must abide by.
Thank you very much, God. Yes, thank you for that. I want to give, everyone 1 minute to say the concluding remarks, and, one positive thing, at least, for your work or the refugees. But before that, I think it's important for all of us to think about the nationality issue question, because if someone has been here for 30 years, honestly, that means all they know is Uganda, all they know is that host country. Why wouldn't such a person, at least as of right, be allowed to be a national, So I think those are some of the things that we can talk about. Good enough to have a scholar here, and we have a lawyer here, maybe such a things to do, and a journalist or and a government official. Those are some of the things we could do advocacy on, because why would someone be in a country for 30 years and they're still refugees, and then they give birth to a refugee also, So that is, and they, after 30 years, it's unlikely that you'll go back to your country of origin and you still even have property or you have where to begin from. So, some such things could be among things we can look at, Beginning with you, Frederick, please, 1 minute to wrap up this conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we need to understand why we actually committed ourselves into making these laws. We have our laws governing who should use which resource in this country, looking at the land, the acquisition of land by foreigners and so on. We have seen so many projects particularly in Arua city under Musiime failing because somebody purported to be an investor has bought land and constructed a huge building just because of these issues. And others come as refugees. At some point, they go back to their country, they come back, you find somebody's doing business. After a few time, he has already bought maybe a house in the city. So how these laws are enforced remains a challenge, and I think it is still upon government to look into it. If enforcement is very difficult, then they should look for another alternative of amending it so that it suits the interest. Two, looking at the issues of the conflict between the refugees and the host communities.
In 20 seconds.
Okay, the conflict, I think we have all the measures to do this, just like people had highlighted the issues of crosses and so on. We have the partners that could take lead into this. As journalists, just like we need to look at now telling stories of how to solve such an issue, other than looking at who should be penalized in this issue, by bringing more of solution journalism, other than exposing the problem, but not giving direction to our viewers or the listeners that we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Scovia, in 1 minute.
Thank you, Martin. I think when we talk about refugees, especially in Uganda, we have to remember that all of our refugees, actually a majority of our refugees, are coming from members of the East African community. And as members of the East African community, our people are actually supposed to have freedom of movement, and that in itself should pretty much encourage integration of refugees, because if we're all members of the same community, why are we having these people in refugee settlement for over 30 years? Why should someone who is a member of the same community be entrapped in a refugee settlement that they have to live their whole lives in these type of settings? And so going forward, I think our government should actually try to find that mismatch between our Ugandan refugee policies or migration policies and that of the East African community, and how we can actually bring them together, closing that gap, and make sure that nobody deserves to spend a majority or all of their lives in these settlements. As I mentioned earlier, these settlements, one way or the other, kind of take away the agency of these individuals, and they actually deserve to live their full lives outside of the settlement. So we should move away from this policy of encampment and leaving people in refugee settlements, and actually look in reintegrating them. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Gad?
My view, as I said, I will talk on the security parts. We have had very many journalists, we have had many lawyers, but partly someone who has lived here for 20, 30 or 40 years, one would argue, why can't he be allowed to be Ugandan? That is a policy level. Policy level, that is all about our legislators, our MPs, to debate it. But before the laws are amended, the status quo is maintained. And we can talk. I've been in some very many talk shows, and we get so much excited. We give our views, but even when we give our views on TVs, radio stations, we forget that the policy to be changed, the legislators must be involved. It is the work of the legislators to go and debate and amend these laws. And our MPs, for example, should look into this. Why should someone feel so much comfortable? He has left his country because there was some conflict. Do you mean the conflict has not been resolved for 30 years? I feel some of these refugees are too comfortable in Uganda, and when you get in a place and you are too comfortable, you forget where it came from. That's what
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. God, I don't know why you choose controversy at the end. Otherwise, that is to take us into a longer debate. But thank you for you. You are very, calm, but until you decided to be controversial. But I also know you stand in political shoes. So, but we leave that at that. Yes, Dragan, please, your parting shots.
Yeah, I would start by addressing God's last point, but I will leave it at that. It's a bit controversial. Yeah, I'll give my closing remarks from a practitioner's point of view and in a way of what should be done as a country which is hosting this many number of refugees. One of the things that should be done is improving scholarship in this area. There are very few scholars, very few published authors on issues of forced migration, despite the fact that 86% of displaced people are hosted in the global south. More than 90% of published authors and the academia comes from the global north. So what's the problem? I'm happy that people like Scovia are here. Hopefully they will inspire more people to join them in that field. Maybe also Two is to invest in quality journalism. Because if we don't tell these stories, then there will be no response. I'm happy you brought Dramadri on board, and I didn't know they had that group, but it's good. It's a good step, because if you look at the stories of post-migration, the journalists will only report when there is a disaster, a sudden disaster. They do not tell these slow onset, slow events that result into these sudden disasters. You will only hear of a story of refugees in Rwanda when there's a controversial deal. You realize, even, for example, the Rwanda story, they're just citing the UK Rwanda deal right now. Why? Because we don't have enough journalism in that area. But if you look behind, you realize this is not the first time Rwanda is entering such a deal. It entered into such a deal with Denmark, entered into such a deal with Israel, but you don't hear of these things. Why? Because the journalism is so raw. And we've also seen that in areas where such deals have tried to be implemented have terribly failed. The example of Australia trying to offshore its refugee responsibilities. Then 3, we have to recognize the situation of refugees. We say that refugees have come here and are comfortable, but they are not. If you read the Informing Refugee Policy Response in Uganda, that report shows that yes, all of us in Uganda are poor, but refugees are 17% poorer. So should the interventions still be the same as for nationals? The answer should be an automatic no, because there are quite some differences. Then you also have to pay attention to the emerging areas to deal with nationality and statelessness resulting from intermarriages of refugees and nationals, areas to do with forced migration, actually displacement as a result of natural disasters, volcanic eruptions, floods, and whatnot. Because we know that under the OAU Convention 1969, it expands the definition of who a refugee is to include people who have been displaced by occurrences which cause which cause
which are environmental disasters or something like
no,
that.
I forget the term which is used, but which cause disturbances in serious disturbances in public order, and we know that those can include environmental disasters. So can we also try to address the issue of climate refugees? I know they are not legally and technically recognized right now, but can it be? Can we explore that area? This goes to that. And the other important.
Lastly,
access to justice. Give me 15 seconds. Access to justice, especially for refugees. Because if you look at people, especially lawyers, working in these situations, we are very, very few. Very few, yet we are serving millions of people. So if we can have policies that make sure that more lawyers can come into this area and serve these people, then the interventions we give these persons of concern will be effective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In fact, actually, it has been projected that the biggest cause of refugees is going to be environmental issues. Actually, many refugees are going to be because of the environment. And, you know, because of the damage to the environment. And we see that happening so much increasingly in many countries. Thank you very much for being part of this show. We honor and celebrate the stories of refugees, and every right of a refugee matters, and they also are supposed to enjoy equal rights like any other human being. I have been your host, Martin Musiime. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to our distinguished panel who have helped us understand the status and understand issues around refugees in this country and globally. Thank you very much. See you next time.